Jennifer's bringing this story to us about saving Indigenous speakers from COVID. And this is an area of study that she is involved in and brings a lot of knowledge to the table on this. Jennifer, we did not start the show with the land acknowledgement.
Yeah.
So I know we're mid-show, but if you would like to do a land acknowledgement now, and then you can go into your, I think it's a nice chance to get it in there as we're talking about Indigenous issues.
That was kind of my plan because I forgot about it too. My bad. But I just would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on. I'll acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We acknowledge the people past, present, and future of the Duwamish tribe, the Muckleshoot tribe, and other tribes on whose traditional lands we work and live. And again, I think that's extremely important for people to get in the practice of doing. And for our national viewers, people outside of the Seattle area, I urge you to kind of, maybe get invested and look into the origins of your own land and the people that lived there.
Thank you so much for doing that. And do you want to jump into the story? Or do you want me to do your clips?
So just to kind of want to preface this story a little bit, COVID has been particularly hard hitting on people within Native nations, specifically federally recognized Native nations. And I clarify federally recognized just because they're not federally recognized. Why is that so hard to say tonight? Doesn't mean Native. They're not actually Native nations. For example, the Duwamish. But the studies that have been done on reservations belonging to federally recognized nations have demonstrated that COVID has hit at twice the rate of the general public. And so kind of really thinking about this and then what that means in the context of language preservation and the longer history of that. So if you want to roll the clip, then I'll talk about it a little more.
And we'll roll that clip for you.
Thank you.
More than 5 weeks ago, the $2 trillion coronavirus relief package was signed into law by the president. Set aside their $8 billion appropriated in aid for Native American tribal communities to battle the virus. $0 of the $8 billion had actually been released and dispersed to help those communities.
This region did have one of, if not the highest per capita COVID infection rates, as well as death rates in the country. Because of the remoteness, it can be hard for people to access care.
Our facility staffs were the first one to open the box, and they were absolutely shocked. They turned completely white.
They expected a box of PPEs or COVID testing supplies.
So it was quite a shock to everybody to instead to receive body bags.
The idea of disease coming into your communities and wiping them out is very, very real in your institutional memory.
Yeah, absolutely. We have that historical memory of that happening, wiping out. I mean, it diminished our whole tribes.
When they were shopping here, some of our elders, some of the store clerks would say, "Go home, you dirty Navajo. Don't bring your disease here."
To be able to be on the list, to be the first to receive something, it to me, it just kind of shows that the tribe is putting our elders and our speakers in the proper place.
The Cherokee Nation is one of several tribes placing a high priority on its elders and native language speakers.
When all of us first language speakers are gone, it's going to be gone. Nobody's going to be able to speak like we do.
Thank you for that, Jennifer.
Yeah, so just to clarify a little bit, the funds in question, the coronavirus funds that we talked about back in April have since been released. There was some kind of contestation over how they would be allocated and to which Native peoples, and there was some issues with, because tribes in Alaska are actually their own kind of corporations, and that's the way they're set up because Alaska was settled so late and there's not treaties, and it's very different in that context. But that money has since been released to Native nations. But the issue we've noticed recently, and I've read some reports that the Cherokee Nation and of course many of the Sioux, Lakota, Dakota peoples were doing extra to ensure that their native language speakers were being protected from COVID, including early vaccinations, because of the significance, long-term significance of having native speakers and how many were lost due to things like boarding school and assimilation policies throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, not to mention, the ways in which disease in the past has basically decimated native peoples. They estimated at the time Europeans settled North America and disease went wild, smallpox and other diseases, YARS, and even the measles, that around 90% of native population was lost. So this has been ongoing, and native peoples aren't, this isn't new for them, this experience of loss due to introduced disease. And so they're especially protective of their culture because of so much cultural loss as a result of ongoing US assimilation policies and efforts to physically and culturally exterminate them. And so the fact that these native nations like the Cherokee and Lakota, and I've read some reports of local native nations like the Yakama doing similar things to preserve language, is extremely important, and just kind of, I guess, lends itself to this longer, very contentious history of assimilation and loss that Native peoples have experienced, and of what they're kind of doing to overcome that.
Yeah, it's I know I'm like a little bit at a loss for words over this, because it's complicated. There's we say on the show all the time, there's a lot to unpack. It's very complicated. I know that when I spent some time at Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, they have a radio station. I have no reason to believe that it's not there anymore. It's all in Lakota. And there are less than 5,000 native speakers of Lakota in South Dakota left alive. But that is part of their efforts to keep the language alive, is to have the radio station. And the radio station is all Lakota. It's all in Lakota. I also know, I don't know what tribe Sacred Spirits was. This was a series of albums that was done in the 90s. And it is all of these Native American chants that were kind of done with some techno music on the background of it. And the whole idea is that if they would provide this is a medium for people to listen to these chants and go, here is the language, and then here is the translation of it, then our language will carry on in the music. And I know that there was a series of albums that was done with that, but we're once again, we touched on this last week with your story, but we're once again in this place of like, genocide's like a tough word at this point, but it's like institutional negligence that is perpetuating, trying to finish off the genocide that started a few hundred years ago.
Oh no, honey, this is settler colonialism. This is like colonialism 2.0, but it just never goes away. That's how we define this kind of ongoing effort to assimilate, dispossess, acts of genocide directed at Native peoples in the United States, Canada, Australia, what we call settler colonial nation states. Because, traditional colonialism, of course, was, you sent out people in service of the metropole, they gathered resources, they extracted, they basically raped the landscape, enslaved people, and then brought all of that back to the metropole. But with settler colonialism, you have this ongoing colonialism that doesn't end, and it sets up institutions to keep itself in power, and it's very interested in land and resources. And in order to realize and bring that to fruition, it needs to, quote unquote, deal with its Indian problem. And that usually occurs through these acts of physical and cultural, genocide. So that's kind of how we frame it. But what's particularly interesting to me, and I was thinking about this in the context of settler colonialism earlier, is the Seattle Indian Health Board getting all of those body bags back in May when they asked for personal protective equipment. I mean, that's if that doesn't give you an indication of the long-term relationship between Native peoples and the federal government, and this, questions of genocide and, removal and dispossession and all of these other things, I don't know what does.
One of the things that jumped out at me when we were researching to pull clips for you for this story, it was really hard to find clips.
Yeah.
There's very little coverage on what is going on. There was a fair amount of coverage for the Navajo Nation in particular, but only because things are so bad there. I mean, we have Doctors Without Borders operating in the United States. They're operating on the Navajo reservation. They are operating in Florida, and they're operating in Louisiana. And look, if you're one of these America, USA, ooh types, you should be fucking humiliated that Doctors Without Borders is operating in our country, because we spend the most on healthcare out of any country in the world, and that is how bad we've dropped the ball.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting too is that the Navajo Nation, and not that they're not deserving of this attention, has always been kind of the poster child for the relationship between Native peoples and the U.S. If you look back to the poverty special that was done on them in the 60s when they were trying to advance all of the poverty bills, you look at all of these things there because they're the largest. If you go back to the New Deal, when John Collier was trying to get people to accept, the Native nations to accept the New Deal, he went to the Navajo Nation first because they were the largest and he thought most influential, and it would gain him the most traction in Congress. But he went there and implemented this really terribly harmful stock reduction program that basically just rejected any traditional knowledge and did a whole lot more harm than good, and caused the rejection of the New Deal, the what they called Indian New Deal, the Indian Reorganization Act, by the Navajo Nation, which in turn was, basically its, downward spiral after that. So it's not uncommon for the Navajo Nation to receive that kind of attention. And I think it does, it's good insight into what's going on in Native nations, but it doesn't tell the entire story. So I'm really glad that we're able to talk about, what Lakotas and the Cherokee Nation are doing to preserve, and how bad it is across Native nations throughout the United States, and not just within the Navajo Nation.
And to your point about colonialism and this ongoing war, let's go back to South Dakota. And I'm careful to go back because I have that personal connection. But you had the state government there, and Christy Noem, the governor of South Dakota, who is practically a COVID denier, was fighting against tribal authorities to open up the highways through their reservations. And she even went to the federal government going, make them open up. And the federal government was like, what part of sovereign nation and treaty do you not understand?
Which is weird to me, because that's like, the federal government doesn't normally do that. Totally expected that to go the other way. And I think that just shows the disregard that a lot of white people, through these ongoing processes of settler colonialism, white people in power in particular, have for what Native sovereignty actually means. And I think they're just willing to kind of, because the U.S. has been so flippant and frivolous and just basically disregarding of treaties until its hand is forced in things like through the Supreme Court rulings and whatnot. I think that a lot of people in power in the institution of settler colonialism itself actually lends itself to white people going, we don't need to pay attention to what Native sovereignty means. And they don't understand the significance of it. So I don't know. I'm hoping that, this COVID pandemic that we're all experiencing, that has, been proven to be worse for BIPOC people, and particularly Indigenous people living on reservations. I hope that we can get it under control so they don't experience more, more cultural loss.
Shell just made a comment, it's 2020 and there's people on reservations that don't have running water. One third of the Navajo Nation doesn't have running water, and they live in the middle of the fucking desert.
Yes, they do. Yep, they do. They do. It's, and there's all kinds of, federal predatory lending programs that go on Native reservations. And, so many have made such significant gains through economic developments and other economic initiatives to help kind of, create space to express sovereignty, and also to strengthen their own cultural, political, and social autonomy. But there's still so much that has been so much, I guess, a legacy of not great things left over from these ongoing poor relationships with the federal government.
And it continues on to this day.
Yeah.
One of the things I always like to, and I think I'll probably be saying this every show, right? We're two white people up here talking about BIPOC LGBTQIA issues. And I want to amplify a Indigenous voice. Can I go ahead and roll this clip?
Yeah, please do.
If we're only given an opportunity to speak English, therein lies some tremendous challenges for thousands of our relatives going back into the decades and generations, and to know that the United States of America made it a policy for natives to not speak their language. So that's of course a human rights violation. But that's another thing to spend time on. Right now our focus is on bringing the language back so we can be healthy and well and fulfill the prophecy that our ancestors gave to us. It's often said that our language, Indigenous language, in this case Lakota, they're spiritual. The languages are spiritual. And they give us an opportunity, we say the Creator gave us the opportunity to express ourselves with that language. So essentially what happens is our spirit inspires us, our mind creates, so out comes our words that we want to share with each other. And our language, because it's spiritual, there's no profanity in our language. So we're always looking for to give thanks to the Creator for our health, and in a humble way ask for continued health. Because it could be, as some of us were taught, in a twinkling of an eye, things could change. So we never want to take any of that for granted. So when we express ourselves with our language, it's an opportunity for us to do that in a most reverent way. Because the language is spiritual, there's an instantaneous connection. And it's a good feeling because nobody should ever feel that they feel alone or that they're alone. So our language helps to make certain that it never occurs. So there's step one, if you will, or there's a simple understanding of what health is. Health is given to us one breath at a time. And with our language, we're able to remind ourselves of that, remind each other of that we are relatives.
Justin Taken Alive, tribal elder of Standing Rock Indian Reservation of South Dakota, and despite all of the efforts of the tribe and officials there, has left us, and with that, his language.
Yeah. I just like to give a shout out. Lakotas do a really great job of putting out consumable media for not just Native peoples, but for non-Native peoples as well. And they actually, I think it was like 2010, they put out this really great documentary called We Are a Horse Nation. And it's all in Lakota with English subtitles, or the majority of it is. But it's fantastic. And I think if you Google it, you can still support it. It was for substance abuse. And it's like $6, and it's the most beautiful film. So if people are interested in that kind of stuff, it would be great to support that cause and, kind of learn a bit, especially their horse culture is really, really fantastic and so significant to them. So I just thought it would be nice to kind of give that shout out.
Yeah, if one of the mods could put that into the comments and the name of that documentary, and why don't you just one more time so that we know that the mods have caught it.
It's called We Are a Horse Nation, and it's absolutely.
And 2010.
Yeah, I think it was 2010.
It really is a beautiful language when you listen with an open mind. It is a very, very beautiful language. And it's a fascinating language because it seems simplistic when you listen to it with an untrained ear, and actually it is an extremely complex language.
Yeah, yeah. I can't remember. I was talking to Jean O'Brien. She's Ojibwe, and she's a professor at the University of Minnesota. And she was like telling me there's 4 different ways to say one word depending on how you're trying to use it in a particular sentence. She's not Lakota, of course, but just talking about Indigenous languages more broadly and how complex they are. So that always comes back to me anytime I hear anybody talking about Indigenous language or talking about learning Indigenous language, like it might somehow be easy. I go back to that moment.
The other thing I want to close with is, we highlighted Jesse Taken Alive and his statement. His wife, Cheryl, also a native speaker, died 3 days after him, also from COVID.
Yeah. So.
And, it just goes on and on. And I had talked about last week on just how utterly corrupt the Bureau of Indian Affairs is. It makes HUD look like it's run by the Boy Scouts, and a lot of people would go, HUD is just irreparably corrupt as an organization. And I've always just just do an hour of reading on the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and your brain will melt if you have any compassion in you at all.
Or just read about tribal governance on Pine Ridge in the 70s that lent itself to the Wounded Knee incident.
Yeah. And again, that is something, when things maybe normalize, we'll bring you on the show, and we could do almost like a special on that. It's a whole thing.
Yeah, that would be amazing. That would be amazing. It's a huge thing. We could talk about Native activism throughout the 60s and 70s more broadly, because so much of it ties into the Seattle area.
It's a terrible part of U.S. history, and as we talked about last week, a terrible part of history not taught.
Absolutely.
It's I know last week there were comments well, could you just give here's the 5 seconds of it. U.S. military with tanks and machine guns shooting at Native Americans at Pine Ridge in a full-on military standoff, and President Nixon, paranoid, delusional, was distracted by this thing called Watergate. And so he was totally checked out in all of this.
Yep. It was, a full-on assault. It was, like I said, there's a wonderful documentary series produced by Native people called We Shall Remain. They have an hour-long episode on Wounded Knee. It's really powerful. Russell Means is on there. A lot of the original A members that were there, Dennis Banks took part in that particular episode too. So it's a really interesting episode. So if people are interested, I highly recommend they watch that. It's through PBS, and it's called We Shall Remain.
And with that, I'm going to go ahead and roll our next commercial.